Before we get into this passage, I want to mention something that I'm changing on this channel for a little while. I'm shifting into more D&D book coverage, starting with the BX books, and I'm doing it on purpose. A lot of my videos are heavily scripted, and that's useful when I'm trying to teach one specific idea. But with these old rulebooks, I don't think the best version of this content is me reading polished lines at you. I think the better version is me reading the text, stopping on the parts that matter, and giving you my honest take in real time. You know, what still works, what I think modern tables forgot, and what I'd actually use at my own table. So this is going to be a little more direct and conversational. And there's another reason why I'm doing this. This is also a primer for upcoming BX solo play on this channel. I want to cover these rules in a way that makes it easier for us to actually use them, not just talk about them. So as we go through these passages, I'm also looking at them through that lens. How does this function in actual play? Today we're starting right at the beginning, and the introduction already gives us some big old school assumptions. Starting with the dungeon, using a mapper, using a caller, and the difference between monsters and NPCs. So let's go ahead and crack this open, and I will start on the introductory paragraph on page B4. At the start of the game, the players enter the dungeon, and the DM describes what the characters can see. One player should draw a map from the DM's descriptions. That player is called the mapper. As the player characters move further into the dungeon, more and more of the dungeon is mapped. Eventually, the DM's map and the player's map will look more or less alike. So, I like the fact that it actually tells you explicitly to start in the dungeon, as opposed to, say, a town. To me, starting in a dungeon means putting the players who are just getting introduced to this game to get right into the action of the game, the main action of the game, which is dungeon crawling. I feel like if the game were to start in a town, that there are too many variables at play. There's just too many different things the characters can do, like interacting with townsfolk, shopping, looting, getting involved in political intrigue. Whereas with the dungeon, it really comes down to a simple procedure of exploring, using resources, mapping, and having encounters. This reduces prep time significantly for people looking to get into starting gameplay right away. You could, theoretically, as a dungeon master, create the dungeon as the players play along. If you've got enough ideas going on beforehand without having to explicitly write an encyclopedia of backstory, you could get into the game almost immediately after the players roll up their own characters. There's plenty of dungeon generators out there, and there's one included in this BX book, as a matter of fact, where you really don't need to do any prep at all. You could just roll randomly if you wanted to, if that's the kind of game you wanted to play. I also think that in order to start a very effective campaign, you don't start with the entire world, obviously. I mean, how much are you going to really retain once you've written your encyclopedia? As a matter of fact, just start with a situation. You go downstairs into the dungeon, you have your first choice of which passage to take, and you roll for wandering monsters. Now, that's a really overly simplified way of looking at it, but you get what I mean. I mean, players are just going to get overwhelmed with all of the options and all of the detail that you're laying out with them with your huge campaign world, whereas when you stick them in the what I call crucible of the dungeon environment, there's really only one or two or three ways forward, and usually only one way back. Okay, so let's read the next paragraph here. To avoid confusion, the player should select one player to speak for the entire group or party. That player is named the caller. When unusual situations occur, each player may want to say what his or her character is doing. The caller should make sure that he or she is accurately representing all the player character's wishes. The caller is a mediator between the players and the DM, and should not judge what the player characters should do. So, why did old school Dungeons & Dragons use a caller? Well, I think there's at least 2 reasons, probably more. If you've got your own ideas, please comment down below. But for starters, it helps to bring new players into the game. If you have somebody who's got a little bit more experience playing Dungeons and Dragons, they can kind of take the lead role and mediate between the Dungeon Master and the rest of the players. So instead of going around the table and everyone's kind of speaking on their own, you can kind of have a group huddle once every turn or so. The caller takes everything that was said and kind of simplifies it into one sort of unified action. And the new players don't have to feel so overwhelmed with coming up with something off the fly. All the players can kind of riff together to create an action plan. Now, the other reason for a caller, if everyone has a mouthful, a paragraph of information that they want to get across, how's the DM going to keep track of all that? Again, the caller could help to pare things down and simplify it for the Dungeon Master, who can then make a ruling or describe exactly what's going on without all of that information going on. I'm sure there's plenty of other reasons why you would use a caller. Everyone is going to have their own theory, so please go ahead and let me know in the comments below what you think. Here's the next section. As details of the dungeon are revealed, the player characters will meet monsters, which they will have to avoid. The fact that avoid is the first word that they use to describe interactions with monsters is something interesting, which they will have to avoid, talk to, which is the next one, or ultimately fight. So fighting is given as a sort of last resort when moving around the dungeon, which I find to be really interesting. A monster is any animal, person, or supernatural creature that is not a player character. A monster may be a ferocious dragon or a humble merchant. For game purposes, any creature not a player character is a monster. Human monsters are often called non-player characters or NPCs to separate them from other monsters. So, like I said, a lot of people say that early Dungeons and Dragons is deadly, and yeah, that's true, but you're not supposed to get into a fight every single time you run into some monsters. Like it says, first thing you should do is try to avoid all monsters in search of the treasure. The second thing would be to sort of talk your way out of it or bribe your way out of it. And then third would be to fight as a last resort. Now, when you look at the monster reaction table, the only thing that really triggers an automatic hostility on the monster's part is a roll of 2 out of 12 with 2d6. So combat is not the intention of the game. It's more of like a byproduct. Now, this was before like the whole pre-video game era, when Dungeons & Dragons started going more into that in later editions, especially with 5e, where it feels like everything is a boss fight. This was back when it was more about problem solving and using player intellect to get from point A to point B without getting hit at all. Hopefully, because if you did get hit, you didn't have enough hit points to survive. Now, there's another interesting thing that I find in this paragraph, and that is a monster can be an NPC if they are human. So instead of calling a merchant in the dungeon a monster, which you can call a monster, they become NPCs if they're human. But what if a monster becomes human, like maybe the party adopts a goblin or something like that? Do they become an NPC, or are they still considered a monster? That's just something with the wording that I find to be interesting. I think that monsters can become NPCs, and human characters can be considered monsters, like, I don't know, like a group of brigands that you come across in the wilderness. You're going to fight them to the death if they sneak up on you in your camp and try to kill you. But I like the fact that it covers that really early on, because, again, avoid monsters, talk to monsters, maybe those monsters become NPCs. So what I like about this introduction is that it reminds you what BX is trying to do right from page 1. It's not just setting a mood, it's giving operating instructions for adventure play. Start in the dungeon, Give players jobs, make communication clear, treat the dungeon like a real place. Let some things begin as monsters and let play decide what becomes personal. That's a very different mindset than build everything first and hope the session works. And honestly, reading this again is a good reminder that a lot of what people call old school flavor is really just solid table procedure. If you want, I can keep going through the BX books like this and build toward the solo play session step by step. So if that sounds good, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which part of BX you want me to cover next. And if you want practical tools to use while you're running your own games and other cool things, check the Patreon link in the description. I'll see you in the next one.